Some wars don't end when the shooting stops. Others keep raging inside us, especially when you love someone the world told you to hate. My name is Mina Tsukahara. I'm 79 years old and I live alone in an old trailer in Boise, Idaho. One of those that creaks at night and smells like damp wood on cold mornings. My gray hair is always tied back in a low ponytail, and the glasses I've worn since I was 40 help me see, but not forget. I was a nurse during the Korean War. I served as a Red Cross volunteer, but my heart was torn between the orders I followed and the windows I peeked through, looking at the side they told me was the enemy. I treated American soldiers with steady hands, but my deepest secret was that I silently loved a man who was fighting against us. These days, my life is quiet. I tend a small herb garden out back, read old letters no one else remembers, and sleep with the radio on just to hear another voice in the dark. But sometimes the silence speaks louder, and that's why now I'm opening the door to my memories. So if you've got a minute, sit with me. Picture yourself sipping tea, crickets chirping outside, while an old lady shares something she's held in her chest for decades. This story is for you, and for every woman who ever loved where she wasn't supposed to. And if it touches you in any way, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Maybe you've got a secret too, one that deserves to be heard. I still remember the dust, not the kind kicked up by soldiers' boots, but the kind that clung to your soul. A fine, invisible dust that built up inside you, in the corners of your chest, every time the silence weighed more than the sound of gunfire. The first order I got in the war was simple. Stay calm. They said it looking me straight in the eyes, like I wasn't just a rookie nurse, but a wall they needed to pin all their leftover hope onto. I was 25, and hiding a childlike fear behind my glasses. It was 1952. Korea was on fire. And me? I was just another woman in a white uniform, trying to look brave in a land I couldn't even pronounce. That morning, they loaded me into a jeep with 3 other nurses. We drove for hours on torn-up roads until we reached what they called a forward recovery station. In reality, it was a ripped canvas tent that reeked of sweat and antiseptic, where broken men tried to remember who they'd been before the grenade went off. My job was to clean wounds, change dressings, hold hands. But no one told me I'd have to learn how to bear the gaze of those who no longer had eyes. On the very first day, with the sun still high, 2 men carried in a wounded soldier. He didn't speak English. He was handcuffed and bleeding under a green olive uniform, but not from our side. The air went still. Even the older men paused, like time itself had lost its rhythm. And then someone muttered, "He's the enemy, but orders are orders. Orders to treat, orders to heal, even if he was the face on the hate posters." I stepped closer, hesitant. He looked at me, and time really did stop. It was a look full of mud and pain. But there was something else I'd never seen before. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry either. He had a strange calm, a calm that felt older than the war itself. That's when I realized uniforms aren't souls. They're just disguises. "Name?" I asked out of habit. He didn't answer, just kept staring at me, like he was trying to guess who I really was behind the white coat and the slanted eyes of someone born a foreigner, even in her own country. "Name," I repeated. One of the soldiers carrying him whispered something in translation. "June," he finally said. "June." And when he said it, he looked at me like he was giving me something more than a name. Like he was saying, "I'm human, even if you've all forgotten that." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my cot, still in my dirty uniform, hair loose on a makeshift pillow, listening to the sounds of the camp. Coughs, snores, whispered prayers, and a fuzzy radio playing some American tune about home. But what kept me awake was that look. It wasn't passion. It wasn't curiosity. It was a mirror. A mirror showing me I was at war on the inside, too. Because, you see, when you're a nurse in a war zone, you learn to share everything. Food, time, fear. But no one teaches you how to split your heart, and mine, without realizing, had already taken a step toward the enemy. The next morning I went to check on him again. He had more cuts, a bruise spreading down the side of his face like blue ink on wet cloth. I cleaned the wound in silence. He didn't look away. One of the soldiers chuckled. "You're treating him too nice, Mina. Might end up falling for that commie." Everyone laughed. I didn't, because something inside me didn't think it was funny. Not because I liked June, but because something told me that war wasn't just tearing up bodies. It was warping how people saw each other. It was like suddenly there were two kinds of pain. The pain you were allowed to feel, and the pain you had to ignore because it came from someone your country told you to hate. But the nurse in me didn't know how to hate. She knew how to stop bleeding, take temperatures, count breaths. And no matter how much they tried to teach me to see enemies, all I saw were bodies. I saw souls. That night I wrote in my diary for the first time since arriving. Just one line. He said his name like he was asking to be remembered. And I remembered. Every nurse carries more than just a stethoscope. She carries an invisible language made of glances, hands that tremble before holding a scalpel, silent promises stitched between one suture and the next. And in war, that language becomes the only one that matters. The next week, June came back to the infirmary. This time, no handcuffs, but with the same eyes. I don't know if it was on purpose, but every time he walked into the tent it felt like the wind outside stopped. Like even the dry bushes around us went quiet just to hear what wasn't being said. He had more wounds, some healing poorly, others looked fresh. I had a feeling he was being beaten outside that tent, maybe by soldiers who couldn't stand sharing the camp with someone who reminded them of everything they'd lost. But no one ever told me, and I never asked. In war, too many questions are like landmines. Step on the wrong one, and everything blows up. That day I was alone with him longer than usual. We were one nurse short. Another had been reassigned to a more critical post. It was just me and him, separated by a crooked screen and a metal tray table that echoed even the lightest thought. I started with the bandages. They were poorly wrapped, like someone had done it in a rush or out of anger. I knelt beside the cot, touched the cloth gently. He didn't move. "Do you speak English?" I whispered. He looked into my eyes, and for the first time answered. "A little." It was like a window opening, not a big one, but one of those high, narrow windows that lets in a thin beam of light into a dark room. I pulled up a low stool, kept working. Meanwhile, I asked what little could be understood, where he was from, if he had family, if he was in pain. His answers were short, but they carried a tired sweetness. That kind of sweetness you only see in people who have lost so much, they don't see the point in hating anymore. He was born near Kaesong, had a sister, loved drawing before the war, and now he didn't think he'd ever see any of it again. "Why did you become nurse?" he asked with a heavy accent. I took a while to answer, not because the question was hard, but because it caught me with my hands deep inside the silence, because I wanted to hold what others drop. He didn't smile, but his eyes, they got wet. Right there between bandages and invisible barriers, I realized something that haunts me to this day. War tries to turn us into steel, but some of us fight back by staying skin. I started noticing the little things. The way he folded his blanket, the care he took closing his eyes when a distant siren wailed, the almost reverent respect in how he never looked at my body, only at my face, as if he saw more than a nurse, more than an American, as if he saw someone alive, even in that field of the almost dead. In the days that followed, our meetings became routine. Nothing intimate, nothing forbidden, just a quiet constancy, like the ticking clock in the medic's tent or the steam rising from dawn coffee. But inside me, something was growing, like a seed planted beneath the snow, invisible, but stubborn. I couldn't tell anyone. Not Ellen, my tent mate. Not the chaplain. Not even myself. Because something about it felt wrong, or so I'd been told. It was wrong to touch the face of someone who didn't wear your flag. Wrong to hear the voice of the other side and feel peace. Wrong to love where hate was expected. But I loved. Not with kisses, not with promises, but with presence. I loved the way he said nurse like it meant safe. I loved that out of everyone who called me. He was the only one who didn't expect anything, except for me just to be there. And that mutual presence, was everything we had. One day he drew me, with charcoal on brown paper. He folded the sketch and slipped it into my thermometer case. It was rough, but beautiful. The lines were harsh, but the eyes were the eyes he saw in me. Ones I'd forgotten were even mine. I kept that drawing inside my Bible, between the book of Ruth and Lamentations. It felt right. Ruth had crossed borders for love, too. And Lamentations. Well, those were the prayers I whispered every day since stepping on that foreign soil. The nurses said I'd gotten quieter. The head doctor noticed I smiled less. But no one knew. And they couldn't know. Because my secret was made of flesh, but not sin. It was made of care, of hidden tenderness, of silence between heartbeats. And there, between bandages and barriers, I learned that love isn't breaking rules. It's remembering that under every uniform, there's someone who bleeds too. It was the middle of the night, one of those nights when the sky feels heavy over the camp's canvas. Everything was silent except for the steady drip of IV fluid and the occasional groan from one of the cots in the back. I was on night duty, the only nurse awake. The doctor was already asleep in the makeshift trailer, and the post radio buzzed out a Korean song someone forgot to turn off. It was in that silence that he called me. At first, I thought I imagined it. The voice was soft, drawn out, almost a breath. Mina. My whole body froze. Not because I was afraid, but because there was too much tenderness in that imperfect pronunciation. Tenderness. And something I didn't think still existed in that war. Care. I stood still for a moment, like someone hearing their own name after years of being forgotten. I looked around. Everyone else was asleep. Only he was awake. Sitting up, eyes fixed on me. He wasn't feverish, didn't need meds, wasn't calling for help. He was calling me. Did you call me? I asked, still unsure. He nodded slowly, his head tilted like he didn't want to intrude. Just gently reach out. Mina, he said again. But this time like someone writing a name with their voice, like someone holding it in their mouth with reverence. I walked over slowly, sat on the stool beside his cot. His hands rested on the sheet, palms open, and his face calm. For the first time, he didn't look like a prisoner, or a soldier, or an enemy. He looked like a man trying to remember what it was like to love without fear. "Why did you call me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, looked down, then said, "Pretty name, but also good name." I was speechless. That sentence was so simple. But in war, Simplicity was rare. Everything was hard, coded, full of rules and commands. And in that moment, he gave me a gift that didn't come in a box. He saw me as a person, not as a nurse, not as an American, not as a symbol, but as Mina. Every letter. I thought about saying something, anything, but I stayed quiet, afraid of ruining the moment with words. He continued, "When I hear name, I feel calm." "Why?" I asked. "Because not war. Because not war." That phrase cut through me like a scalpel. That was it. To him, my name was the only thing in that tent that didn't mean destruction. And in that moment, I understood something I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. Sometimes, the biggest secret of war is who it turns us into when no one's watching. Because there, in that tent, no witnesses, no weapons, no maps of power. I was becoming someone who didn't belong on the battlefield. Someone who listened, who felt, who remembered that names matter. That every name has a sound, a story, an origin. Mine came from my Japanese grandparents. It means beautiful garden. But no one had ever explained it with as much gentleness as that scarred man. We stayed in silence for a while. He closed his eyes, and I sat there, listening to his breathing. It was light, almost childlike, like someone sleeping in a place where, for a brief moment, it was safe to exist. Before leaving, I pulled the blanket over his shoulders, and I made my first emotional slip. I gently ran my hand through his hair. He didn't move, but one corner of his mouth lifted, a half smile, the first I'd seen on him. I went back to the post, sat in the wooden chair and opened my diary. Wrote with trembling hands. Tonight he said my name, and I felt like someone lit a lantern inside me. The next morning no one said anything. They didn't have to. The deepest things between nurses and patients don't need explanation. But Ellen, my tent mate, gave me a long look, the kind that sees more than it should. "You seem different," she said. "Lighter." Lighter. An impossible word in that place. But it was true. Inside me, I carried a name said with respect, and that was worth more than any medal. That afternoon he called me again. Not because of pain, not out of procedure, but because he knew that by saying my name the world felt a little less cruel. And I went, faster each time, more certain that amid all the blood and filth, there was still a clean space. The sound of my name said with tenderness by a man who was supposed to be my enemy, but who, in a way even God couldn't explain, was becoming my home. If you flip through any history book, you'll see maps, dates, battles won and lost. You'll see names of generals, military operations, treaties signed after it all ended. But you'll never find the days that really mattered. You'll never see our days. Because between every recorded explosion, there were tiny silences no one ever wrote down. Moments as fragile as a petal over a minefield. And it was in those in-betweens, in those spaces between the noise, that my story with June took root. It wasn't romance. At least, not in the way the world defines it. There were no kisses, no promises, no lipstick-sealed letters. There was only a string of presences, a bond built through looks, through breathing, through the absence of judgment. I remember one afternoon when it rained nonstop. The canvas tent sagged in one corner, and we had to move all the patients around. As we dragged cots and buckets of water, I heard a soft whistle from the back. It was him, whistling a gentle tune, like he was trying to hold the chaos at bay with music. I stopped, not because of the sound itself, but because of the courage it takes to sing in the middle of ruin. That rain, the smell of fresh blood mixed with mud, and him, whistling like there was a whole world inside him the war couldn't touch. Later I learned it was a traditional song from the village where he was born. Something about a river that runs through rice fields and carries wishes away. And I wondered that night what he would have wished for if he could, if he would have wished to live, or simply to be heard. In those days that don't show up in books, June started helping me with small tasks, washing cloths, organizing syringes, wiping down bottles. It wasn't allowed, but it was invisible. And in war, what's invisible becomes shelter. He'd bring me dried flowers he picked on the path between his makeshift cell and the infirmary. Flowers so tiny they fit in the palm of a hand. Nameless flowers. Like us. I kept them all. Inside the inner pocket of my coat. One by one. Like someone collecting fragments of a time the world would never understand. We started talking more. In the breaks. When no one else was around. He'd tell me about the sea. Said he'd never seen it but dreamed of it. He spoke with his eyes closed, describing the waves like dancing mountains. I, in return, told him about the cherry trees in my childhood yard back in inland California, where my parents planted them with hope, even while being called Jap traitors. We were two outsiders in a broken land, two names that didn't belong in that field. But there we were, just Mina and June, two humans trying to remember what made us whole before the world broke us. One of those unnamed days, he handed me a scrap of paper. He had drawn a nurse with a calm expression. At the bottom corner, he'd written in shaky letters, "When I see you, war stops." I kept the drawing inside my diary, right where I'd written, days earlier, that he had said my name like someone asking for shelter. That week, I got a letter from my father. He said he was proud I was serving the country. Said war was where the strong were separated from the weak. But me, I no longer knew who was strong and who was weak. Was it the doctor yelling at mutilated soldiers to stop whining? Or the prisoner who looked at me with gratitude just because I brought him clean water? I started keeping my moments with June the way you keep small stones in your pocket. Tiny things. The way he placed a hand on his chest when he saw me, like saying, "I'm here." The way he watched me care for others. Not with envy, but admiration. The silence that settled between us when we both knew it was too risky to speak. All of that, every gesture, is what I called love. Not the movie kind, but the kind that is also compassion, presence, and a kind of faith. Yes, faith. Because to believe in someone in a place where everything tells you not to, that's faith. To love someone your country calls a threat, that's faith. And being a nurse in a place like that means stitching skin and soul at the same time. These days aren't in any book. They aren't taught in school. No one gave them names. But they were the days that shaped me. Days when I learned that love can live in a gesture no one notices. That the secret of a broken heart is that it keeps beating, even in hostile territory. And that some wounds are healed not with gauze, but with presence. June never said he loved me, and I never said it to him. But everything between us shouted that word. And maybe that's why we chose silence. Because some secrets become more sacred when left unspoken. And it was in that silence that we lived the most alive days of the war. The days that never made it into the books. But still live in me, like scars that don't ache, only whisper. In war, night is never just night. It's an omen. It's a field of echoes, where even the sound of your own breathing feels too dangerous to be heard. But that night, the sky simply wouldn't stop. It started with a distant whisper, like the world outside was exhaling slowly. Then came the rumble, and then the explosion. The tents shook like sheets in the wind, The pans hanging in the mess hall clanged together like alarm bells. Soldiers stumbled out, stunned, rifles in hand, their eyes too wide to see anything clearly. And me? I was alone in the medical tent, closing the last morphine drawer, like I did every night, when I heard the shouts. "Shell incoming! Down! Everybody down!" It was instinct. I didn't think. I just ran. Rushed past the cots like I was crossing a minefield made of shattered lives. And what I looked for first wasn't an exit. It was him. June was curled up in the darkest corner of the tent, his eyes locked on the trembling ceiling, his hands over his ears, his body folded inward. He looked like a child trying to hide from thunder. And in a way, that's exactly what he was. I threw myself down beside him, wrapped my arms around his shaking frame, smelled the earth and the dried blood on his skin. And for the first time, I prayed out loud, not for the bombs, not for my life, but for the chance to keep feeling that chest rising and falling beneath my arms. The explosions kept coming, each one closer than the last. It felt like the entire sky was crashing down, and for a moment I thought we'd die right there, nameless, unforgiven, with no place in the world. But then, he spoke. His voice cracked, low, torn. "Don't leave me." It was the first thing he ever said that wasn't about pain or memory. It was about now, about us, about whatever lived inside those 4 torn walls of canvas. And in that moment I answered, "I won't." Because it didn't matter what the world said. I wasn't just a nurse for Americans. I was a nurse for pain, for fractured souls, for hearts that no longer found safety in flags. The bombing stopped just before dawn. The silence that followed was louder than the explosions. It carried the rubble of what we had been and what we could never be. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, my face covered in dust, and he took my hand. Not with strength, but like someone holding an anchor, like someone finding solid ground for the first time. That morning no one asked why I was with him. Maybe they assumed it was my duty, that I was simply doing my job. But I knew, and so did he. There, between life and death, we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Later, while changing the other soldiers' bandages, my hands trembled. Not from fear, but from too much truth. I could still feel the warmth of his body, the sound of his voice in my ear, the way he whispered my name even as the world was ending. And I knew that even if he left, even if the war took him from me, one way or another, that moment would be my forever. Later on, I found a button among his things, from a coat he'd never wear again. He didn't ask how it ended up in the pocket of my coat, and I didn't say. War taught us more to hush than to ask. But in that button, there was a code, a silent pact, as if we were telling each other, if everything falls apart, keep me like this, in pieces. The next night, the sky was clear, but I was still afraid, because I understood the real terror wasn't the sound of bombs. It was what came after, what remained, what couldn't be told, and above all, what was impossible to forget. Some people hide secrets in safes. Others bury them in the backyard of their childhood. I hid mine, between pages. War taught me to write with my eyes, because the mouth was always watched. But even among guarded glances and shared silences, I needed a place where I could fully exist. Not as a nurse, not as an American, but as someone daring to feel what didn't fit in the outside world. That's how I started writing letters to him. Letters that would never be delivered. Letters where I said what I couldn't even whisper during quiet moments. In the first one I wrote, "June, I don't know if what I feel is right, but I know it's real. And between the right that hurts and the real that comforts. I choose to keep you in silence. I folded each page carefully and stitched them into the seams of my journal. Between clinical notes, soldiers' names, morphine dosages. It all lived there, as if between pulse readings and blood pressure numbers there was space for love. The journal had a dark leather cover, frayed at the edges. It had been a gift from my mother before I shipped out. "Write down what you don't want to forget," she'd said. And I obeyed. But I wrote what couldn't be remembered out loud. Each day, a new page. Not about the horror of war, but about the comfort I felt when I watched him sleep. About the way his fingers seemed fluent in the language of waiting. About how, among all the screaming, the sound of my name in his mouth felt like dew on burning coals. I wrote about fear. Not of the end, but of what came after. Of what would happen when it was over and he returned to the side the world called wrong. I wrote about the certainty that there would never be a house where we could walk in together without being judged. I wrote about the rage of loving in forbidden territory. And still, I kept writing. It was the only way to breathe. One especially cold night, I dropped one of those pages on the floor of the tent. I only noticed it when I went to bed. I ran back, panicked. The lights were out. The canvas flapped in the wind. And there, in the middle of the dusty floor, it was waiting for me, untouched, like it had been holding its breath. I knelt and picked it up with both hands, my heart pounding. It was the letter where I had written, "Maybe I'll never touch you the way I want to, but still, there are nights when my whole body falls asleep, curled in the shape of your silence." That night I realized my secret was too fragile to risk, so I started hiding the stitched pages inside the lining of my apron. That's right, I sewed them in by hand, between the inner fabric and the back, and every time I wore it, it felt like I was putting on not just a uniform, but my hidden love too. That apron carried everything. The smell of antiseptic, blood, sweat, and the words I never got to say. It was my shield, my cell, my living letter. During treatments, I could feel the light weight of the papers brushing my stomach, and it reminded me that, even in the middle of war, I was still someone capable of loving and of keeping. One day, while changing June's bandage, he looked at me strangely, like he knew. Like even without touching paper, he'd read everything I'd written. "You hide something," he said, almost smiling. I froze, held my breath, lowered my eyes. "We all hide something," I replied. And he just nodded, with the serenity of someone who understands secrets, because he carries his own. A few nights later, I wrote the hardest letter, the one that began, "If I disappear suddenly, I want you to know that what we had was real. And even without words, even without promises, you were the purest part of my life." That time, I didn't sew it in. I placed it inside an empty penicillin vial, sealed it with tape, buried it behind the tent, under a crooked bush growing between rocks, not to hide it from the war, but to make sure that even if I fell, something of our story would survive. I never told anyone, not even him, because love, when it runs that deep, sometimes needs to protect itself from reality. And that's why I hid it all between pages, because pages don't speak, but they also don't forget. And today, even with trembling hands and clouded eyes, I still remember every line, every word unsaid, every verse that, if it had been read, might have changed everything, or maybe not. But the secret, that stayed whole, inside me, inside my uniform, between pages that now only I can still turn. The silence of war is deceptive, because sometimes it comes before an explosion, and other times it comes after someone vanishes. That morning, everything was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't signal peace, but absence. And even though I didn't know why, I could already feel that the day would hurt. I made my rounds like always. Changed sheets, handed out painkillers, counted the morphine vials. But his cot was empty. At first, I thought he'd been moved. It happened sometimes. Patients transferred at night to safer areas. But there was no record, no note, no mention in the log, nothing. I went to the admin tent, asked, trying to keep my voice neutral, like any nurse concerned about a patient. I got shrugged shoulders in return. A sergeant huffed and said, "They probably sent him back to the POW camp. He was here too long anyway." The words hit me like a grenade. I went back to the medical tent, trying to act composed. But my hands were shaking so badly, I dropped a tray full of glass thermometers. The crash shattered the silence like a confession. And inside, I was crumbling. I spent the whole day pretending my body didn't ache, that my eyes weren't scanning every corner, searching, that his absence was just another routine military transfer. But the truth is, my heart was screaming in every language I never learned. That night I opened my journal, but I couldn't write. No word made sense without his presence nearby. All I managed was one angry, aching line, scrawled across the page. How do you heal a heart that wasn't wounded, but ripped out? The days that followed were worse. Each sunrise felt like a mockery of my waiting. Every footstep gave me false hope. Even the soldiers' faces began to blur, like I was searching for his features in everyone. And no one. I quietly asked the chaplain if any undocumented transfers had happened. He said yes. A group of prisoners had been moved to a post further north. But there were no names, no confirmations. In practice, he'd been erased, like he was never here, like I'd dreamed it all. And for a moment, I started to believe that. War does that to you. It erases, confuses, turns everything to dust before memory has time to take root. But then deep in the supply drawer, I found a handkerchief. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't military issue. It was soft fabric, folded with almost ceremonial care, and embroidered by hand, in one corner, a Korean ideogram. My heart stopped. It was his. And somehow, he had left it for me. A final gesture, a silent goodbye, a wordless offering. I pressed the cloth to my face, took a deep breath, and cried. Cried like I hadn't since I was a child, like someone mourning not just a man, but herself. I slept with that handkerchief against my chest that night, like a second skin. And I dreamed of him, not as a prisoner, not as a soldier, but as the man who said my name like it had been created just for him to speak. The next morning I put on my apron like always. But something had changed. I wasn't just a nurse anymore. I was the keeper of a secret, of a love the world had refused. I kept caring for the others, sutures, compresses, injections. But my soul was stitched to an absence. And silently, every act of care became a tribute. Every well-placed bandage was like saying to him, "I'm still here." For both of us. A few days later, I heard about a convoy that had been attacked on the road north. Rumors said many prisoners were killed, but no names were released. And me, I didn't want to know. Because sometimes the only way to survive grief is to keep it suspended, not alive, but not dead either. Just in limbo. I placed the handkerchief inside my Bible, right beside the drawing he made of me. There, between Ruth and Lamentations, our stories shared space. And I understood that, even if the world never knew, I had loved during the war. And that love, even without an ending, was whole. It was real, even if it wasn't allowed. even if it had been torn away. And in that emptiness, between the cries of the wounded and the creak of cots, I learned how to keep going, with the secret in my eyes, with his name echoing in my silence, and with the certainty that some disappearances are never complete, because some loves, no matter how far they vanish, stay alive where no one can see, in the memory of a nurse, and in the pages of a diary stitched with pain. There are objects that take up no space, yet carry the weight of an entire life. In that camp, among syringes, charts, and scraps of rations, his handkerchief was what weighed on me the most. I found it days after June vanished, carefully folded between a box of gauze and a pair of surgical scissors. In the rush, no one would have noticed, but my eyes, the ones Love had trained to see what no one else saw, caught the fold, the texture, the thread. It was small, a square of fine fabric, already a little faded. At the edge, a simple embroidery, a hand-stitched Korean ideogram, almost childlike in its precision. And on the reverse side, his scent. Not cologne, not sweat, but that unique scent of someone who had survived silence. That night I opened the Bible where the sketch he'd drawn of me already rested. I placed the handkerchief between the pages of Lamentations. It felt right. There where the prophets cried out loud, my silent sobs finally had a place to rest. I was a nurse, trained to contain, clean, measure, record. But nothing in my training had prepared me for this, to keep a man's memory like a relic, to stitch memories into my body like invisible sutures from a wound that would never heal. In the weeks that followed, I carried the handkerchief everywhere, folded into the inner pocket of my apron, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. It was like keeping a pulse next to my chest, like keeping alive something the world insisted had died. One night, while tending to a young soldier delirious with fever, he called me Mom. I held his hand until the warmth returned, and I realized the handkerchief was there, folded beneath my arm, as if watching over the moment. In that instant I thought of June, of how he looked at me, without fear, of how he said my name like it was something he had to protect. And there, in the heat of fever and the dampness of dawn, I felt my love for him still breathing. Not in time, but in matter. Not in the future, but in the now. I kept the handkerchief like someone shielding a flame in a storm. With both hands. With a bowed soul. One afternoon, Ellen, my wardmate, caught me staring at my apron pocket. "You okay, Mina?" "Yeah, just tired. Since he disappeared, you've changed." "Who?" "You know who." I didn't reply. But in that moment I understood that even well-stitched silences have visible seams. And she, as a woman and a nurse, recognized the kind of exhaustion I carried. The kind you get when you care for everyone else, but carry a love no one's allowed to see. The following week, we were reassigned to a base farther south. The field hospital would be dismantled, the tents burned, anything non-essential left behind. I gathered my things quietly. But before we left, I returned to the crooked bush, where I had buried one of the letters to June. I dug up the vial with my bare hands. The letter was damp, but still readable. I tucked it away again, folded it next to the handkerchief, and promised myself that if I ever lived long enough to grow old in peace, I would open it all again, like opening an old wound, just to see if it still hurt. The transport was slow. Dust clung to our faces, and inside my suitcase, wrapped between two shirts, was the handkerchief, along with the only part of me that still believed in the impossible. When the war ended, I returned to the United States. They welcomed me with flowers, certificates, pats on the back. But no one knew what I carried inside. No one asked about what wasn't visible. I worked for decades in a clinic, taught students, held mothers in labor, old men in agony, children with fever. But there was always a handkerchief in the drawer of my desk, folded, silent, eternal. Sometimes I'd take it out of its envelope just to touch it, to remind myself that I had loved, even if the world had forgotten, even if he had disappeared. One day my granddaughter, still little, asked, "Grandma, why is this cloth so special?" I smiled, said it was a keepsake from the war. But inside I thought, it's a keepsake from the time when, even surrounded by destruction, I was whole. I never washed that handkerchief, never sewed it, never repurposed it. Because it wasn't just fabric. It was a witness. It was a voice. It was the last thread between me and someone who couldn't stay. And to this day, at 79 years old, it's still here. Tucked between pages, between memories, between the woman I was and the one no one really knew. Because sometimes what remains is what no one saw, what no one named, what no one understood. And that handkerchief is my cleanest secret, my most complete love. There are memories we fold up, tuck away, and pray never to touch again. But fate, that old ironic craftsman, loves to unfold them at the exact moment we least expect. It was a cloudy Sunday. I was already retired, living in a small house with a weathered wooden porch. The radio whispered jazz, and my knees complained about the changing weather. I skimmed the headlines like you'd nod to an old neighbor on the street. No real intent to stop. And then I saw it. In the lower corner of page 3, a small article, nearly erased by the crease in the paper. The headline mentioned something about a reconciliation between Korean War veterans. And there, in the middle of the photo, a face. My heart jumped, as if, decades later, it had recognized the sound of a name never spoken again. I tilted the paper, adjusted my glasses, brought it closer. It was him. Older, thinner, but the same eyes. In the photo, a group of Korean veterans was gathered in Seoul for a symbolic peace reunion. He was standing in the back, hands clasped in front of him, the way he used to do when he was nervous. And the eyes. My God, the eyes. It was him. Even without a caption, even without a visible name. I knew. My body knew before my mind did. I froze. The teacup trembled in my hand. The handkerchief, yes, I still had it, slipped from my lap and fell to the floor, as if it, too, had recognized the man in the photo. I felt something strange. It wasn't joy. It wasn't sorrow either. It was a kind of reunion without touch, as if part of the past had come back just to say, I didn't disappear. I was just hidden too long. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my armchair holding the photo, ran my fingers over the paper like I was trying to feel the outline of a lost face, closed my eyes and imagined, what if I had gone? What if I had traveled to that reunion? Would he recognize me? Would he remember the name he used to whisper when the sky was falling? But then a harsher thought came. What if he didn't want to remember? What if, to survive, he'd buried it all, including us? It hurt, because the secret that gave me strength all those years was also a prison. He lived in me, but maybe I didn't live in him anymore. The next day, I cut out the photo and pasted it into my journal, right below the drawing he made of me, decades ago. And I wrote, if the eyes are the windows to the soul, then today I saw the reflection of what's left of us. And even if we never speak again, I'll keep you as the only piece of peace I ever found in the middle of war. After that, I didn't look for more news. Didn't search names, records, addresses. It would have been easy, maybe. But I chose silence. Because some reunions don't happen in time. They happen in the soul. And ours happened right there, between newsprint and letter paper, between past and present, between two versions of me. The nurse who never stopped caring, and the woman who loved beyond the borders of history. Since that day, I've kept the photo in an envelope sewn onto the handkerchief. They're inseparable now, like we were, even without ever being allowed to be. Sometimes I think he kept something of mine, too. A lock of hair, a look, a word said only with the eyes. Because wartime love doesn't vanish. It turns into a breeze that moves when everything feels too still. Into a dream that visits you in the early hours. Into a name that slips from your lips before waking. And if someday I see that gaze again, in another realm, another life, I'll know, even if the face changes. Even if the body has aged, because some eyes, you never forget, and some loves, even if they live outside of time, live forever where the world can't erase them. Every nurse wears a uniform, but some of us also wear what can't be seen. I, for one, always wore my silence like part of my apron, while tying the straps behind my back, pinning my hair under the cap, swallowing pain with tap water. The silence was already there, like invisible fabric, like a shield, like inheritance. Over the years, my apron held everything: blood, vomit, spilled coffee, the smell of antiseptic and baby powder. But what stuck to it most was absence, because every day, putting it on felt like saying to myself, today, too, no one will know. I spent my life being seen as the one who helps, the one who comforts, the one who doesn't flinch. Even after I came back from the war, that role clung to me like a second skin. In the little town where I lived, everyone knew. That's Miss Mina, widow with no husband, retired nurse, great storyteller, makes the best tea cookies. But no one knew that, inside the closet in my room, tucked between a sewing kit and an envelope of old photos, there was a small wooden box, locked with a latch as simple as it was sacred. Inside, 3 things: his handkerchief, the drawing he made of me, and the newspaper photo. I stopped opening that box often, not because I forgot, but because, after a certain age, memory stops living in the eyes and starts living in the body. It pulses in your knees when the weather shifts. It whispers in your ear when the wind blows from the left. It appears when no one calls it. Sometimes my granddaughter comes to visit. She likes rummaging through my books. The other day she found my old journal, flipped through it, saw my messy medical notes and said, "You used to write a lot, Grandma." And I simply replied, "I had to." Because that's what secrets do to us. They create need, to keep, to protect, to write without naming. I never told her. Not my daughter, either. Not anyone. Because there are secrets that, when told, lose what makes them precious. The weightlessness of having survived time without asking for anything in return. Not recognition, not justice, just memory. These days, when I sit on the porch and the sun hits the wood just right, I think of June. Not with pain, but with the kind of longing that doesn't belong to this world, but to the space between 2 worlds. That small space where war can't reach, where love breathes, even without a name. I never wore an apron again, but sometimes I close my eyes and feel its weight on my shoulders, and I swear I can feel the paper sewn inside, brushing my skin like a promise still alive. People ask if I was happy. I smile, say I had a peaceful life, children, work, respect. But deep down, a part of me stayed in 1952, kneeling beside a cot, with bloodied hands, and a heart full of something that never returned. The war took many things. Fellow nurses, patients whose names I never learned, sleepless nights. But it also gave me a secret, and I cared for it the way I cared for every man who bled in front of me. Today I'm just an old woman with a wooden box. But inside that box lives a piece of sky that never collapsed, a name whispered in the dark, a handkerchief folded with care, and the only love that made me forget, for one fleeting moment, that the world was at war. Some call it a secret. I call it a seam, because it passed through me like a fine thread, stitching together who I was and who the world expected me to be. It wasn't a romance. It had no happy ending. But it had truth. And truth, oh, truth lasts longer than any promise. Being a nurse in a war is about more than knowing how to give injections or change bandages. It's knowing how to stay quiet when your heart screams. It's knowing how to love where no one else sees humanity. It's carrying in your pocket not just scalpels and gauze, but absences, impossible loves, whole lives left unlived. That man, that look, were the only moments of tenderness that bloomed where only destruction grew. And even if he never returned, even if his name was lost in files and maps, inside me, he stayed alive, even now, when the sun sets and my wooden house creaks softly, when the kettle sings by itself in the kitchen, when the old radio hums a tune from decades ago. That's when he returns, with his calm eyes, with the gentle way he said my name, with the folded handkerchief and the fingers that never touched my face, but touched my soul. I kept that secret for so long, it became part of me. And now, sharing it with you feels like opening a window, small, quiet, but just enough to let in a breeze. Maybe you're keeping something too. Maybe you have a name that still echoes when the world goes silent. Maybe you loved someone no one ever knew about. Or maybe you cared for someone, like I did, and realized that care is also a form of love. If that's the case, you're not alone. Life is full of stories no one ever wrote down, but they deserve to be remembered, not with noise, but with reverence, with listening, with compassion. And if this story touched something inside you, even if you can't name it, tell me, in the comments, or in silence, looking out the window while the rain falls, like I do. And if you feel someone else needs to hear it too, share, like, subscribe to this channel. Here we make space for what never had a place, for the letters never sent, for the names still living inside us, even when the world forgets. Thank you for staying with me this far. Truly, you're now part of this secret too.